Hey everyone, hope you're having an amazing day. Today, we're diving into a thrilling story about Uri and Tu Tieu, who are on the run from Lynn, a cunning and ruthless mastermind who will stop at nothing to track them down. Will they survive her traps? Or is this just the beginning of a deadly game? Stick around, because you won't want to miss a second of this suspense. And if you enjoy the story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss our upcoming videos. After narrowly escaping Lynn's relentless pursuit, Uri and Tu Tieu had found themselves in a small, secluded house, tucked far away in the quiet suburbs. The roads leading there were dusty, seldom used, and lined with thin, scraggly woods that swayed gently in the wind. From the outside, the place seemed almost idyllic, peaceful, still, and safe. It was as if the chaos they had fled had been left miles behind. But inside, for Tu Tieu, the calm was deceptive. Fear clung to her like a second skin, a constant reminder of the danger that had shadowed them for days. She maintained the lie she had been feeding Mrs. Lynn, her adopted mother, that this trip was nothing more than a brief getaway, a chance to clear her mind and take a break from the pressures of daily life. Her voice remained calm and measured when speaking to Mrs. Lynn over the phone, careful not to give away the truth. But Mrs. Lynn, despite trying to believe her, sensed something unusual in her daughter's tone. There was a tension, a subtle undercurrent that didn't belong in an ordinary conversation, yet she brushed it aside, convincing herself that Tu Tieu just needed space, never imagining the horrifying reality that her daughter was fleeing a kidnapping plot orchestrated by Lynn, her own adopted child. Meanwhile, miles away in the bustling city, Lynn stood silently by a massive glass window, her eyes sweeping across the traffic below. To anyone watching, she might have seemed contemplative, even serene, but inside, she was already calculating, already in motion. A message had just arrived. Someone from within her team had leaked the kidnapping plan to Uri. For most people, such a betrayal might provoke anger, screaming, or frantic questioning. Not Lynn. She remained ice cold, her composure unshaken, without interrogating anyone, without demanding explanations. She simply issued one short, calm command, as if she were ordering tea instead of orchestrating a murder. Eliminate him. Leave no trace. By the next morning, the man had vanished completely, as if he had never existed. The news reported it as a traffic accident, a life ended abruptly by misfortune. But for Mrs. Lynn, seeing the familiar face in the photo sent a jolt through her chest. He had visited her house multiple times in his role as a company employee. The timing was too precise, too perfectly coincidental. Her instincts screamed that something was wrong, but she dared not confront the truth. Instead, unease settled like a weight in her chest, growing heavier every time she looked at Lynn. Lynn's demeanor only deepened the confusion. She moved through the house with meticulous care, pouring tea, speaking softly, attending to Mrs. Lynn with the devotion of a daughter. Every gesture, every word was flawless. To anyone observing, Lynn was the picture of perfection, someone who seemed incapable of malice. But beneath that perfect exterior lay darkness so profound, so methodical, that no one could imagine it. Mrs. Lynn tried to convince herself it was merely an unfortunate accident, yet a tiny fissure had formed in her trust, subtle but sharp enough to cut deep. Back in the suburbs, Uri had turned the house into a fortress of sorts. Every lock had been checked twice, every code changed, and improvised security devices were scattered across the rooms. He moved with a methodical precision, the quiet clicks and clinks of his efforts echoing through the still house. Tu Tieu watched anxiously, pacing slightly as her eyes darted toward every window and shadow. "Do you think this place is safe enough?" she asked, her voice betraying the tremor of lingering fear. Uri didn't answer immediately. His gaze was drawn to the distant woods at the edge of the property, where long shadows stretched across the ground, shifting subtly as the sun moved. Finally, his voice dropped low, carrying the weight of a hard truth. "Lynn won't stop." Before Tu Tieu could respond, Uri's phone buzzed. He picked it up to see a message from an unknown sender. "She silenced the traitor. You can't run forever." Uri's grip on the phone tightened briefly, but he erased the message without hesitation. He turned to Tu Tieu, and in that moment, there was a shift in his expression. Fear was still there, but it had transformed into something sharper, something resolute, the readiness to fight, to protect, and to outthink the enemy. "We have to be prepared," he said firmly. "Running isn't the solution." Tu Tieu grasped his hand tightly, feeling the unspoken determination radiate from him. She understood now that escaping Lynn's reach had only been the beginning. The real challenge, the real danger, was only just starting. They weren't simply hiding anymore. They were preparing to fight back against an enemy who had already proven she would stop at nothing. The house itself seemed to absorb their tension. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind through the thin trees outside, carried with it a potential threat. Tu Tieu moved through each room, checking windows, doors, and improvised barriers, her mind racing through every possibility. Uri followed closely, silently noting weaknesses and imagining ways to fortify their sanctuary. Together, they worked as a team, synchronized in their preparation, yet always aware that Lynn's cunning could overcome any obstacle. Hours passed in tense silence. Even the quiet of the suburbs felt unnatural, charged with anticipation. Each passing car, each distant noise, was a reminder that danger could arrive without warning. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the shadows grew longer and more menacing, stretching across the house and surrounding woods. Every corner of the small home was now part of a defensive strategy. Every line of sight calculated, every possible entry point reinforced. Tu Tieu couldn't help but replay the events in her mind. The betrayal, the chase, the chilling precision of Lynn's cruelty. And yet, amid the fear, there was a spark of determination, a glimmer of courage that no amount of terror could extinguish. She realized that this was no longer just about survival. It was about standing firm, about facing a calculated and relentless adversary who would not relent until they were caught or eliminated. By nightfall, the house, which had seemed a sanctuary during the day, took on a more ominous air. Shadows stretched across walls like dark fingers, and every faint sound, branches brushing against the siding, the wind through the trees, was a potential warning. Uri remained alert, every sense heightened, watching and listening for the slightest sign of intrusion. Tu Tieu tried to rest, but sleep was impossible. Fear and adrenaline kept her senses sharp, every instinct screaming that Lynn's presence could be near. Despite the tension, there was clarity in their shared understanding. They had survived, they had escaped, but they could not hide forever. The battle ahead required courage, careful planning, and an unwavering determination. Each precaution they took, every lock checked, Every code changed was a step toward preparing for the inevitable confrontation. In the quiet of the small house, Uri and Tu Tieu faced a simple truth. The chase was far from over. Lynn was patient, strategic, and utterly relentless. And while they had found temporary refuge in the suburbs, the real test, the battle against a merciless, calculating enemy, was only beginning. The next morning, the small house was eerily quiet. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting faint stripes across the floor. Uri was already on his feet, checking every corner and window. Tu Tieu followed, still shaken, still haunted by the message from the night before. "I feel like no matter where we go, she knows," Tu Tieu whispered. Uri didn't answer right away. His eyes scanned the dark woods outside. "She's not all-knowing," he said, "but she's patient and smart. We have to be smarter." They couldn't just hide anymore. They had to anticipate Lynn's moves, prepare countermeasures, and leave no room for mistakes. Uri turned to Tu Tieu, his gaze firm. "Every step from now on has to be deliberate. No errors." All morning, they reinforced the house, changing locks, securing windows, rigging improvised sensors. Every action was precise because their lives depended on it. But the more they prepared, the heavier the anxiety grew. Lynn could strike at any moment. Late afternoon brought another anonymous message. "You can't hide. She knows everything." Uri read it, then deleted it instantly. Turning to Tu Tieu, he said, "We can't let her intimidate us. From now on, we take control. Running won't save us." Night fell, and the small house felt vulnerable. Shadows stretched across the walls. Leaves rustled like whispers of warning, and every sound seemed amplified. Uri stayed awake, alert to the slightest movement. Tu Tieu couldn't sleep. Each creak of the house made her heart race. Then came a subtle change, a faint reflection in the window, a shadow moving differently from the trees outside. Uri froze and signaled Tu Tieu to stay silent. A light step, almost swallowed by the wind, reached their ears. "She's here," Uri whispered. Tu Tieu's heart pounded, but she didn't shrink back. She knew running wouldn't save them. They had to face her, to fight. Uri positioned himself between her and the potential threat, ready for anything. Outside, Lynn paused, calculating, assessing every risk. She thrived in chaos and manipulation. One wrong move from Uri or Tu Tieu, and she would turn the tide instantly. Inside the house, their eyes met. No words were needed. In that silent understanding, both knew the truth. Courage, cunning, and confronting the darkness head-on were their only chances to survive. The night dragged on, tense and unrelenting. One fact was undeniable. Lynn would not stop, and Uri and Tu Tieu had only one choice: fight or be swallowed by the storm she had unleashed. After narrowly escaping Lynn's pursuit, Uri and Tu Tieu hide in a secluded suburban house, trying to stay one step ahead of a relentless and calculating enemy. Lynn, cold and ruthless, eliminates anyone who threatens her plans without hesitation, keeping her dark intentions hidden behind a perfect facade. As Uri fortifies their temporary refuge with locks, passcodes, and improvised security, Tu Tieu realizes that running isn't enough. They must prepare to fight. Anonymous messages warn them that Lynn is always watching, and the tension escalates as night falls. Shadows, faint sounds, and subtle movements create constant fear, but also sharpen their determination. When Lynn finally approaches, Uri and Tu Tieu must confront her head-on, facing a deadly battle where survival depends on courage, strategy, and the will to outsmart a merciless adversary.